Hi, kids. I'm going to talk to you today about the question, what is journalism? And then we're going to look at some of the characteristics that would make something news. I kind of just gave it away. What is journalism by saying the word news? And a lot of you know this already. Journalism is news writing. News writing. Sometimes kids who haven't ever heard this term before think journalism is writing in a journal, like keeping a diary, but it is not that. It is news writing. And people who do journalism have a special name, and I almost just said it. They are called journalists. 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 People who do journalism are called journalists. So a lot of journalists write for newspapers that you can hold in your hand. Other journalists write for web-based news outlets. There are a lot of different like news channels online or news websites. Some journalists write for people who give the news on TV. Like if you're watching TV in the evening, or if your parents are watching TV and the news is on, and the person who's talking to you, the person whose face is in the screen, is telling a news story, they haven't memorized it. They're reading it out loud. So somebody wrote the story that they're reading. Probably not them, right? There's somebody else, but somebody wrote that news story that they're giving to you there with their mouth, and that person was a journalist. So, what makes something news? Fun question. It's not merely information, right? Because you could read your history book and learn all about the Civil War, but we wouldn't say that anything you learned about the Civil War is news. In order for something to be news, in order for some information to be called news, it has to have certain qualities, and 4 qualities actually, and I'm going to tell you what they are. All right, so the first thing that has to be true for something to be news, and this is this first blank, is news has to be current. Current. Current means like recent, up to date. Has to be current. If it's not current, it's not news. Like somebody could say, hey, did you hear Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address? That's not news. It didn't happen recently, right? Now I say here that's relative. When something's relative, that what we mean is it depends. So how current news is depends. If you're getting all your news from the internet, then a news story that was published 24 hours ago might not feel like news anymore. But if you're reading a newspaper that only gets printed once a day, something that happened yesterday still feels like news. The internet, of course, gets updated continuously, right? If we travel back in time 200 years and somebody rode into your town on a horse and said, hey, guess what just happened in a state 4 states away? Even if it's something that happened 2 months ago, it would be news because it would be, pretty current to you because that's as fast as it can travel. So when I say current is relative, I mean it depends. What does it depend on? It depends on how fast news travels, right? So, okay, the next quality of news is for something to be news, it has to be unusual. And I'm not going to spell that because I think you know how to spell it. If you don't, just open a new tab and type the word unusual and then see what Google says, see how it corrects you. That's what I do every time I don't know how to spell a word, and that's what I want all students to do as well. All right, so for something to be news, it has to be unusual. I say that is also relative. Oh, what am I doing there? My goodness. So what's unusual to a person in Ridgewood might not be unusual to a person living in New York City. For example, let's say somebody got bitten by a dog on the street. If that happened in Ridgewood, that would probably be news to us because how often do people in town get bitten by other people's dogs? Like bad enough to say go to the hospital? Not that often. We have kind of a small town. So that would be news. Maybe it would be in the Ridgewood newspaper. If somebody in New York City got bitten by a dog, that's not going to be in the New York Times. New York Times doesn't care if somebody got bit by a dog. They got other stuff to worry about, right? Because it happens all the time. So whether or not something is unusual is relative. It depends on who the audience is. Another thing that has to be true for something to be news is it has to be, this is a word that sounds like relative, but don't confuse it. It has to be relevant. Relevant to the readers of the news or relevant to the viewers of the news. Relevant means it has to do with them. So relevant, that's relevant. So something that's going on in like, a lot of my relatives live in this town in Iowa of like 800 people called Correctionville, Iowa. You can Google it if you want. Something that's happening in Correctionville is news to people in Correctionville, but that's not going to count as news for people in Ridgewood, New Jersey, because we don't really care what's going on in a town of 800 people in Iowa, right? It doesn't affect us. It's not relevant to us, so it wouldn't be news for us, but it would be news for them. Unless it was something like so incredibly unusual that like it's relevant to everybody. Like if somebody in Correctionville, Iowa was born with two heads, that would be relevant to everybody because it's so odd. But most of the time, stuff happening in a tiny little town in Iowa is not going to be relevant to us. Stuff happening in our town is not going to be relevant to them. And the last thing that has to be the case for something to be news is it has to be true. True. If it's not true, it's not news. It's just an urban legend, or it's a rumor, or it's a myth. Right? It has to be true for it to be news. Current, unusual, relevant, true. CURT. Or you could rearrange those letters and do TRUC, truck, except with no K on it. Okay, so I don't know if you are familiar. There is a satirical news website on the internet called The Onion. Some of the articles in The Onion aren't really like middle school appropriate, they're more high school appropriate. So I'm not suggesting you go like read a bunch of Onion articles, but I'm going to show you some of them to try to make the point about current, unusual, relevant, and true. And here's why that works. When you look at a satirical article, a joke news article, a lot of times what makes it funny is it's breaking one of these four things that make news news. It's like violating one of these qualities of news. Either it's not current, or it's not unusual, or it's not relevant, or it's not true to the point where it's ridiculous. So here's one. The Onion magazine. This is intended to be, this format is intended to imitate the format of, let me see if I can show you here, the format of the New York Times magazine. If your parents get the New York Times magazine delivered to their house, you've probably seen these covers before. New York Times magazine cover usually has like one single person or thing in the center. And then they have this like pretty kind of super old timey, like medieval looking font, maybe you would call it. So the cover of the New York Times magazine is a very distinctive look. It's usually like artistically interesting, and then it has this font. So The Onion made this thing, The Onion magazine, and their headline is a picture of a computer that looks like the computer I might have had when I was in high school in the 1990s. And it says, could this be the age of the internet? Now the date on here is 2013 or something, which is when they wrote this article. And the reason people like me laugh when we see this is because this could never be a news story because it's not current. Like, yeah, it is the age of the internet, and it has been for like a couple decades now, bruh. Could this be the age of the internet? Of course it's the age of the internet, right? So this is not current. That's why it's joke news. Maybe it's not that funny to middle school kids. It's funny to me when I saw it. Could this be the age of the internet? Oh my goodness, I wonder. Here's an Onion news story that makes me laugh a lot. The headline is, Area Mom was waiting in the car for 20 minutes. Great, now she'll be late. So this, you would never see this real news story, right? But why is it funny? Let's read it. According to sources within the carpool lane at Lexington High School, your mom has been waiting for you in the car for over 20 minutes, and now she's going to be late, which is just great. All right, that makes me laugh. It's funny to see written in this very newsy kind of tone this thing that would never actually be a news story. Now, why wouldn't it be a news story? One is it's not unusual. Remember, current, unusual, relevant, true. This happens every day, thousands of times a day. Back when we were going to school, this happened at GW like every day. And also, it's not relevant because in the news story, the writer is addressing you, like a single person. So, not really relevant to everybody else. Okay. Here's another thing that could never be a news story. A lot of times, news outlets will report on recent scientific findings that they think are interesting to the general public. This fake news story is from the science and technology section of The Onion. Study, colon. That means here comes a study. Americans enjoy watching TV, comma, eating. Now, why is that funny? Because, duh. Right? Do we need scientists to tell us that? Let's see what it says. According to a new study published Monday by the Pew Research Center, Americans enjoy watching television and eating. Our research indicates that residents of the United States take great pleasure in watching television, often for many hours at once, and enjoy eating food in large quantities, preferably several or more times per day. Okay, this would never be a news story. Why? Because it's like, we don't need a study to tell us that this is true. It's not unusual. Can't be news because it's not unusual. This is something that everybody already knows. Okay, this could never be a news story either. The headline is Factual Error Found on Internet. Gasp. It says, the information age was dealt a stunning blow Monday when a factual error was discovered on the internet. What? The error was found on Ted's Ultimate BradyBunch.com, a Brady Bunch fan site that incorrectly listed the show's debut year as 1968, not 1969. And then here the caption under the photo is the shocking error. Okay, why isn't this ever going to be a news story? Because it's not unusual, right? It's not unusual for there to be an error on the internet, so nobody's ever going to write a news story about it. Here's one. Why is this one so funny to me? This is my favorite one. I'm not sure why. Family's horrific 45-minute screaming match ends in consensus to go to Macaroni Grill. So basically, it's a long news story about this family having this huge fight about where they're going to eat dinner and how they end up going to Macaroni Grill. But it's written like it's news, right? Here's the first paragraph. Following 45 minutes of intense arguing and bitter protests, a heated screaming match between members of the Carroll family came to an end Thursday evening with a consensus to eat dinner at Macaroni Grill, household sources reported. I think it's worth it to pause and just read this whole news story because to me it's very funny. The kids like shouting and running to the room and slamming the door, and eventually they all go, but they're still mad. There are some tears involved. But why would this never be in a newspaper or on a news website? Because it's not relevant. Like, this happens all the time, but it's not relevant to anybody but this family, right? Like, here's how it could be news. Let's say the daughter went upstairs, Kristen Carroll, there she is. Let's say the daughter went upstairs and went in her room and like texted her cousin, like, I hate my mom and dad so much, right? That would be relevant to her cousin because they're family. So that would actually be news if this imaginary girl was sending this story to her imaginary cousin. That would be news to them. But it's not going to be news on a news website or in a newspaper, right? Because it's not relevant to anybody outside of the Carroll family. Here's my last example. Horse Connect, the social network for horses, bought for $1 billion. You know this social network, right? Horse Connect. It's right up there with Insta and TikTok. Here it says, in an exciting development for what many tech insiders are calling the hottest startup in Silicon Valley, Horse Connect, the social network exclusively for horses, has been acquired for approximately $1 billion, sources confirmed Thursday. All right, this is not a news story. Why? Because horses can't go on the internet. They can't use apps because they're horses. So this is my example of something that's not news because it's not true. It's not true. Could never be true, right? It's just ridiculous. All right, so current, unusual, relevant, true. The last thing I want to say about that is like, even though when we think about news, we think about newspapers and we think about news websites and maybe we think about news radio, if you go back in time, like tens of thousands of years, human beings still had news, even when we didn't have a way to like write it down for each other. News was just whatever was current, unusual, relevant, and true that we were passing along to our neighbor. And you're actually exchanging news with your friends like all the time. If you hear something that just happened recently and it's kind of weird, and it's true, you're going to pass it along to someone that it's relevant to. You're going to, text them or shout it across the street, or when we're at school, you'll say it to them in the hall when you're at your lockers together. So we're giving each other news all the time. We just, because we are a society, we have these institutions that we've developed to systematically give all the news to everybody every day. Things like newspapers and news websites and news radio. Now, there is stuff out there that pretends to be current, unusual, relevant, and true, not in a jokey way, but in a way where they actually are trying to trick you. It's called fake news. And we're going to talk about fake news a little later in the quarter. But today, all I want you to know is what journalism is, and that people who do it are called journalists, and that for something to be news, it's current, unusual, relevant, and true. And that's it.